Act 3. Open Conflict. In the 1990s, we enter into a dark period for Mormon feminists' relationship with the church. There are going to be a number of open conflicts and excommunications in this period. There's a sense of restlessness in the articles that they were writing. Things are moving forward. There's great new scholarship, but it seems that the church isn't really changing. The Sonia Johnson issue is a decade old by now, but loomed in the background. Yet, there was also a sense, almost 20 years after the pink issue, that these issues were somehow passé. Consider the opening to the fall and winter 1990 issues, which were dedicated to women's history, feminist theology, and so on. A woman's issue in 1990? Doesn't that smack of tokenism, of division rather than unity, of sexism rather than sexual equality? Perhaps it would if women's voices hadn't been integral and almost proportionate in dialogue for more than 20 years now. Perhaps it would if the landmark pink issue of 1971 and red one of 1981 hadn't mattered so much to both men and women. This sense that there was something strange about still talking about this topic 20 years later strikes me as interesting. The fall 1990 issue has a great essay on theology, Allison Walker, Theological Foundations of Patriarchy, and another by Bettina Lindsay, Woman as Healer, that looks at the history of women and gifts of the Spirit. There's also articles on domestic violence, the good woman syndrome, and other important topics. One is on Mormon women and the right to work. Lavina Fielding Anderson has an article, The Grammar of Inequality. I just want to give one quote from this one. The scriptures are profoundly exclusionary. It is an agonizing paradox. But to the degree we love and use the language of the scriptures, we also love and use the language of exclusion. I feel that women must be fully included in the gospel of Jesus Christ, not because the scriptural texts fully include them, nor because our theology perfectly includes them, but because any other pattern does violence to the fabric of the universe, distorting and misshaping the image of God that I strive, however imperfectly, to see and reach toward. When language becomes a veil, masking and disguising God, then it is imperative, as a matter of spiritual health, that language change. I think the process, though arduous, will be accompanied by joy. It's interesting to me to see the negative reactions to these issues. Responding to the issues in 1990, there's a letter in the summer of 1991. Equity between the sexes is unquestionably an issue of importance, but one might reasonably ask if it is the only issue. The fall 1990 issue of Dialogue was devoted almost entirely to this issue and was a major part of the winter issue. Perhaps instead you could have devoted some space to addressing the completely one-sided treatment of this topic in Dialogue. Surely the word dialogue does not mean that those holding one point of view should spend their time and energy reinforcing one another's prejudice. Is dialogue going to treat a wide range of issues in an intellectually honest manner, or become merely a propaganda machine under the control of persons with only one point of view? Another letter from fall 1991. I have only recently finished a cover-to-cover reading of the fall 1990 women's issue, but I must send my thanks and sense of awestruck appreciation for an issue of such power and magnitude. I have pondered for some weeks now just what I can possibly say to express my sense of indebtedness to each and every contributor, and unfortunately I've come up empty-handed. Still, I must somehow try. There are great historical studies that are coming out during this time period as well, including the winter 1991 issue, which includes Lola Van Wagenen's In Their Own Behalf, The Politicization of Mormon Women and the 1870 Franchise, which is especially relevant given the 2020 anniversary of the National Franchise of Women, and also this is the subject of Laurel Thatcher Ulrich's recent book, A House Full of Females. So that takes us up to 1993, and this is a big one. The whole spring 1993 issue is powerful and one of the most controversial ever published in Dialogue. The one essay that I want to focus on here is related to feminism, but it's not exclusively about feminism. First, I need to give a little background. For a little more than a decade before this, since the early 1980s, tensions between church leaders and scholars had been heating up. Historians are publishing a lot of material that is embarrassing church leaders. You've got the Hoffman forgeries, which hurt them twice, first when they publicized the content, and then when they turned out to be fakes. As church leaders were playing ping pong with Mormon scholars, some of them were going after them behind the scenes and some were protecting them. Tensions were really high. Enter Lavina Fielding Anderson's article, The LDS Intellectual Community and Church Leadership, A Contemporary Chronology, which is a 60-page article on what she calls ecclesiastical abuse. This represents the early work of the Mormon Alliance that Paul Toscano had started when he was seeking organized pushback against church leaders interfering in scholarship. Quote, "The clash between obedience to ecclesiastical authority and the integrity of individual conscience is certainly not one upon which Mormonism has a monopoly. But the past 2 decades have seen accelerating tensions in the relationship between the institutional church and the two overlapping sub-communities, I claim, intellectuals and feminists." This article really is about historians and feminists and acknowledges that scientists and others might also have their stories. But the issue with the new Mormon history movement and various feminists during the ERA and afterward needed airing. Lavina belonged to both communities, historians and feminists. The article then discusses conflicts from 1972 to 1992, but really focusing on the prior decade before that. And it takes people through the beginning and end of the Leonard Arrington stint as church history and his exile afterward. And it documents many episodes of intimidation of historians. It quotes letters from general authorities attacking in general and specifically certain historians for airing unflattering history of church leaders. And it goes over the church's efforts to disrupt the International Women's Year Conference. And it discusses Sonia Johnson's excommunication. The Committee to Strengthen the Members, or the Strengthening the Church Members Committee, is behind a lot of this supervision, which had been publicly exposed in 1992 as headed by James E. Faust and Russell M. Nelson. It reveals that several of those who were being investigated had files on them, and that Salt Lake City seems to be calling local stake presidents and bishops. Some of the main characters in this story are Paul Toscano, D. Michael Quinn, Lavina Fielding Anderson, Linda King Newell, Maxine Hanks, and others. In 1991 to 1993, this is receiving a lot of media coverage and is really a low point with the church's interactions with these groups. LDS intellectuals are speaking out. They're comparing this to McCarthyism. Eugene England's essay compares it to the Salem witch trials. So Lavina Fielding Anderson is unfortunately excommunicated for this article as part of the September 6th, which included other prominent feminists, Maxine Hanks and Margaret Toscano. Many others were caught up at BYU and elsewhere who weren't necessarily excommunicated, but a lot of pressure was put on them. The summer 1994 issue has another special topics issue devoted to women. Janice Allred's groundbreaking article, Toward a Mormon Theology of God the Mother, is a foundational piece of scholarship on this topic. Martha Sontag Bradley, Seizing Sacred Space, looks at women's engagement in early Mormonism. David Hall's article, Anxiously Engaged, Amy Brown Lyman and Relief Society Charity Work 1917 to 1945, informs his later full-length biography of Lyman, an indispensable work of what women's authority in the church was like before correlation. There's also one of my favorite articles of all time in dialogue, Lynn Matthews Anderson, Toward a Feminist Interpretation of Latter-day Scripture. I think it's an indisputable piece of scholarship that's still relevant. Margaret Toscano also has a classic essay in this issue. If Mormon women have had the priesthood since 1843, why aren't they using it? That looks at the new light that scholarship had been done on the Relief Society in the 1980s that uncovered new stories about the role of the priesthood keys in the founding of the Relief Society. This was a tough period of conflict with church leaders, but I wanted to end with this. Cecilia Conchar Farr's Dancing Through the Doctrine, Observations on Religion and Feminism, which appears in the fall 1995 issue. Now, Farr had run into troubles at BYU as part of the 1993 crackdown, but she wants to desecularize feminism and find space for feminist critique of religion from inside positions of faith. Quote, religious feminists, and certainly Mormon feminists, might lay some of the blame on the loss of religious discourse in feminism, not only on our reluctance to use it, but also on a wrestling away of this language by the conservative groups who have set up feminists, along with witches and lesbians, as the enemies of God. Perhaps I am also writing in response to the question that I hear often from many of my, as we say in Mormonism, Gentile friends. Why do you stay in such a male-dominated religion? I'm often tempted to ask them, admittedly begging the question, which institutions they associate with that are not dominated by men, their banks, their government, their schools or factories or hospitals. I stay because Mormonism means something to me at the deepest levels of my being. So I find myself in my own religious odyssey, sitting in a structure I have deconstructed, but that I still admire. I stare at the clouds through the open beams where the ceiling once was and admire the beams without wishing for the ceiling. And certainly I have no plans for a desert escape. It's a tough position to take in this particular historical moment as an intellectual and a feminist. I love my church, and I am proud to be a Mormon.